Kemi Badenoch, 42 votes. James Cleverly, 37 votes. And Robert Jenrick, 41 votes. So, as a result of that ballot, James Cleverly is eliminated from the contest, and Kemi Badenoch and Robert Jenrick now go forward to the ballot of members. Thank you very much for your attendance.
Welcome to Quiet Riot, the politics podcast that turns the political chat from rollicking boil down to a nice simmer. I am Naomi Smith.
And I am Alex Andreou. You are very welcome whether you have lent us your ears before or if you are a novice. If you are a new Quiet Rioter, you are likely to hear things you will not hear elsewhere.
Like it's complicated, or I'm not sure, or even a respectful disagreement. We hope that you leave this place with more information and less anger than you entered it.
So stow away your baggage, fasten your seatbelt, recline your seat, and let's take off to another Quiet Riot.
Quiet Riot. Welcome to Quiet Riot. I'm Naomi, back from Greece and raring to go.
And I'm Alex, actually from Greece and raring to go.
And I'm the producer Kenny, for whom Greece means one thing and one thing only: Olivia Newton-John in leather.
On today's show, and then there were two. Kemi Badenoch and Robert Jenrick are the final two in the Tory leadership contest. We dole out the antacid and try and digest the indigestible.
Plus, the C word, yes, class. Why is it such a uniquely prickly thing for Brits? And as we promised, we return to Starmer's big EU reset with intel and insight.
Everyone wants a youth mobility scheme, it seems. Perhaps even the people who can deliver it. But why? Why haven't they? All this and regular features Wokie Dokie, as well as Grin and Share It. It's going to be a pretty packed show.
But first, let me introduce today's guest. She's the senior politics editor at The Conversation UK. It's a non-profit news website, free to read, with an academic bent. She's also the presenter of its new brilliant documentary podcast series on class, Know Your Place. Welcome, Laura Hood.
Hello, thanks for having me.
Laura, you left Twitter before it was cool to leave Twitter.
I'm a trailbreaker.
You last posted with any frequency in 2022. This was pretty unusual for a professional journalist. Did you spot a trend that took the rest of us a bit longer to notice?
I'd like to think that I did. I'm already finding it just too arduous to find a good conversation on there. I just found it too difficult to have bad faith conversations all the time, and there isn't any respectful discussion.
How long had you been on?
Quite early.
Yeah?
Yeah, I had a boyfriend who was a dev when I was young, and he put me on there without me really knowing what I was doing. He's long gone, and so is my Twitter presence. To be honest, I still lurk. We all lurk.
You lurk.
I don't think you can exist in politics or media without lurking.
But you're mainly a receiver.
But I'm a receiver of information.
Is your boyfriend still there?
He's no longer my boyfriend, and I don't care where he is.
I was hoping to have an X on X.
An X on X, I'm sure he is.
Quiet Riot. 6 strangers invited to an isolated location, Birmingham, where they are about to face an arcane trial, a battle to the death. Their gracious host, Rishi Sunak, mysteriously absent. Their retreat cut off. Secrets are revealed as one by one they meet their grisly fate. Copies of the macabre nursery rhyme hang in every bedroom. 6 little Tories went on a spree. 1 did a bad conference speech, and then there were 3. 6 little Tories went to the zoo. A bear went up against 2 sharks. And then there were 2. So we now know that Robert Jenrick and Kemi Badenoch are the final 2 contenders on whom Conservative members will vote. To my mind, the Tory MPs have managed to both eliminate the candidate who was most popular with swing voters and ensured that whoever now wins starts without the support of most of the MPs. Alex, what do you think? What do you think? I mean, once you stop laughing.
They are a unique group having managed to lose an election against themselves, just now, basically. James cleverly went to the conference and his cri de coeur was, let's be more normal. And the party responded, no.
No. Well, not the parliamentary party.
I mean, well, that's 25 quid. I'm not...
Yeah.
For starters, to explain to our guest Laura, I joined the Conservative Party on a sort of the cheapest membership 2 months ago because I was like, I need to vote. I need to at least select the least insane candidate when they're down to
Oh
two.
my God, who are you going to vote for?
I know, and this is the nightmare scenario, basically. They are both incredibly right-wing, just in different ways.
Well, what I'd love to do is to just have a bit of chit-chat about what we think might have happened. So I'm just going to remind everybody of the numbers. So when it was the final four, Tugendhat gets knocked out with 20 votes, cleverly soared up to get 39, Jenrick got 31 and Badenoch 30, and now cleverly fell back to 37 and is knocked out, with Jenrick climbing 10 to 41 and Badenoch climbing 12 to 42. Now, Tim Montgomery, Conservative commentator, is saying that cleverly lent too many votes to another candidate, and that's what's happened. But Peston said that he was briefed that Jenrick had lent votes to cleverly to oust Tugendhat.
In the last round. Which would make more sense, I think.
I think that probably does make more sense. I mean, look, we know that they do this. They do it every time.
Yeah.
They'd be more rehearsed at it in that.
Well, indeed.
So a bit of a dog.
Like, what?
Didn't someone say there is no electorate more deceitful
than the Tory
than Conservative
MPs?
MPs?
Yeah.
It's also not a massive selectorate at this stage. There's only a
120.
handful of them left. So the math is
121,
not
and
even...
the chairman of the 20 committee didn't vote.
And neither did Sunak, I don't think.
No, he did.
Oh, he did?
He must have.
Oh, okay.
Because the total is 120.
Would love to know.
So I'd love to know who you voted for.
No,
I mean,
what a tangled web
they're
we weave.
Very good mates with Jenrick for a very long time, but Jenrick was one of the people that kind of torpedoed him. So, yeah.
We may never know. It's the most banter outcome imaginable. None
Cleverly,
of us
I imagine,
saw.
actually, Sunak probably voted for Cleverly. Screwed him over. So, okay, I think there was some kind of jiggery-pokery, okay? I'm using that really specific. I hope you
Technical
appreciate
term.
it, coming from a scientific...
Yes, absolutely.
From a scientific publication. There was definitely some jiggery-pokery because... The candidate that went out yesterday, Tom Tugendhat, was very One Nation-y. Now, not all his 20 votes would have been One Nation.
Nope.
But to see all of them effectively go to Badenoch and Jenrick, plus 2 that went from Cleverly, it's simply too much. And either the other 2 candidates basically lent votes to Cleverly in yesterday's vote, to lull him into a false sense of security, into thinking he was definitely home and dry.
And so he then may have lent some votes to to try and stop Jenrick or whoever he didn't want to be up against.
Yeah, or he lent too many votes to try and knock out Kemi Badenoch, who is seen as a stronger candidate with the membership. Or a combination of both happened. Shapps was running Cleverly's campaign, known as Spreadsheet Grant, and I can't see him make such a catastrophic error of the latter variety without some of the former.
Yeah, it's too simple, isn't it? The numbers are too small to
because it's like you need 40.
Yeah.
You need over 40. So it's not a difficult threshold to keep to when you're trying to manage 40 voters. I mean, for someone like Shapps, I would probably, as a candidate, trust him to deliver that. So there must have been something else going on.
But we're talking about Tory MPs as if they are a sophisticated electoral group, and they're not. I've worked with them. They paint a very good picture of being sophisticated and Machiavellian, but at the heart, it remains a venal, self-interested, exceptionally myopic environment. I've got a really heavy suspicion that what happened today was that a lot of people thought, right, Cleverly's a shoe-in for the final. I'll get my number 2 in as well. And they were voting for their second preferred candidate on the assumption that they would then have Cleverly and their number 2 in, and they were home and dry. And you don't have to be particularly clever to take that approach. And that would play to the level of self-interest and, short-sightedness I'm familiar with these guys.
I have to say there were some signs, because Tim Montgomery, who you mentioned already, he founded Conservative Home. He switched from Tugendhat straight to Jenrick, saying that he saw Cleverly as the continuity candidate. And Nick Timothy also switched straight from Tugendhat to Jenrick. And those two are quite
Influential,
I think, among Tories. And from, I guess, slightly different factions, although broadly. But, I mean, the net result is that there is now not going to be any sort of conversation as to what direction the Conservative Party moved towards.
No.
There's just going to be two different flavours of ultra-hard right to choose between. And
which of those poses more of a threat to Nigel Farage? Because it was Cleverly that may have caused Starmer a bit of a sleepless night.
Yeah, for sure.
Neither Jenrick nor Badenoch probably do. But Farage, maybe?
I mean, I have to say, I think Badenoch is a tricky customer. And something happened last week that caused me to question a lot of my assumptions. So Luke Trill, friend of the show, invited me to watch a focus group online that he was running as an observer. And it was post the various speeches, and it was a selection of people who had left the Conservatives in the election just gone and voted for other parties. And it was a mixture of other parties, Labour, Lib Dem, Reform, etc. And it was a Kemi Badenoch love fest. She was every single person's favourite. And all of them kept saying that she seems strong. She seems to know what she's about. And so I think at that moment I felt a little pang, that I felt once before when the first time I was doing polling work, maybe 20 years ago, when I remember it was a survey about the most popular brand of cigarette. And the results came back, and it was like Super Kings.
Super Kings, wow.
Super Kings this, and Benson and Hedges that, and Embassy. And I thought, not a single person I know smokes any of these brands. Like, Marlboro Lights were, I think, number 10, but there was none of the other cigarettes that everyone I knew smoked. And
because people were on the cheap ones.
For whatever reason.
And your rich mates forked out
for whatever reason. But the point is that not only are we a bad sample to judge things just from ourselves, but because our circle is self-selected, we get a really skewed sense of what the opinions are out there, which don't necessarily...
And what were people saying about the other candidates? They were saying Kemi was strong. Did they have pejorative views of the other ones?
And interestingly, all had put Cleverly in second place because they thought he was the other one that was clear and communicated well. So, I mean, I'd be very happy if I were Kemi Badenoch, I think. I think she's going into this as the favourite. She's much more popular with the membership. But judging from the opening salvos, I saw a few interviews on Sky with MPs from Jenrick's camp. And the point they were all pressing was Robert wants to leave the ECHR, Kemi wants to stay in it. Mm-hmm. So they're framing it in terms of leave, remain, the contest, which is just utterly bizarre considering that Kemi Badenoch is an actual Brexiter.
And Jenrick
was a Remainer. So now they've completely flipped, remade their image somehow. And
the result will be 52-48.
But it's going to be a very interesting test of, as you said, they have quite a similar offering in very different packages.
Yeah.
Badenoch says the same populist messaging in a much less histrionic style. And Farage is successful for his anger and his sort of very emotional delivery, and Badenoch has none of that. So it's a really important test, I think, of this kind of culture wars messaging in a completely new package that we've not tested before. And it's quite troubling, I think. She is clearly a very intelligent, intellectual person. She knows what she's doing. She's incredibly defensive. She hates the media. But it is going to be really interesting to see how she does with this calm, sort of seemingly thinking.
But that's
way
the thing.
of
She
delivering
comes
extreme
across
messaging.
as that when she's in control of what's going on, of the room, of the narrative, of what she's saying, and as the opposite when she's being challenged. So it will be interesting to see. I suspect, interestingly enough, I think they're both irrelevant to Nigel Farage.
Really?
Yeah, because I think his pitch is, you've tried them, they were useless, you've tried them, they were useless, now try us. And no amount of repackaging will do anything about that. And it's interestingly what Maureen Common found, that voters that have gone over to Reform will be the most difficult to win back for the Tories. Like the low-hanging fruit are voters who have gone to Labour, then voters who have gone to the Lib Dems, and by about twice as much voters who have gone to Reform. Like only 1 in 10 will even consider voting Conservative again in this Parliament.
Yeah.
So they're angling their entire offering towards winning back a quite unwinnable group.
Forgive me for not knowing the answer to this. And Luke Trill, if you're listening, where was my invite to...
You were on holiday again.
Was I though? When am I ever actually off work? Anyway, I'd be curious to know how many of them were 2019 switches to the cons, as opposed to lifelong cons that have only just in 2024 left them.
Right,
If
I
you know
don't
what I mean,
that.
because that is really quite interesting
I
about
don't know that.
how soft a swing voter they actually
I can
are.
obliquely tell you something that goes to that a little bit, in that they also found in a separate piece of research that a lot of people stayed at home who are habitual Conservative voters. So he's saying these are not like the people who just came out once to vote for Brexit or just came out because they like Boris Johnson. For 75%, so 3/4 of the people that stayed at home, that was their first time ever not voting and not voting Conservative.
Yeah, yeah. We saw a lot of that in our campaign as well.
And again, I'm not sure that's a group that will be tempted to come out by people talking about the European Convention of Human Rights. You know, they're probably slightly more interested in the economy and the...
Well, if they were turned on by that, they'd have turned out and voted Reform.
Well, exactly.
Right. On a side note, Badenoch and Jenrick will now have to donate £150,000 each to Conservative Central Office.
How? From what?
And that is on top of the 50,000 that each of the final four had already given.
So basically you have to have 200 grand to stand.
And apparently it's going to be used for redundancy payoffs because they're having to let so many people go. And that was
of course it is.
reported on by Lucy Fisher on her X account. So, look, it'll be their donors that stump up for this. But it'll be interesting to see the money flows, given how much scrutiny we've had.
Yeah, but God forbid anyone gives them a pair of fucking glasses.
I think we're overlooking one of the most important aspects of today, which is how much joy this shitstorm is bringing to the political world. Can I just briefly read my 3 favourite reactions at the moment?
Go for it, Kenny.
The first one is from David Goke, who not that many weeks ago wrote a very good piece explaining why he had rejoined the Conservative Party. And like you, Alex, he's now saying, well, that was 39 quid. That could have been better spent, wasn't it? And then,
That is exactly right.
absolutely spot on. And then 2 messages from friends of the show. Henry Morris, who you remember has written a book about the Conservatives in iambic pentameter, has just tweeted, yeah, the Tories are stuck between a cock and a head case. And Ian Dunty, in his own style, said, in retrospect, it's entirely predictable that a candidate would tell the Conservative Parliamentary Party to act normal, and its response would be, fuck that.
The other thing that Cleverly said at conference last week, that he was very sorry to the members that the Parliamentary Party had let them down. So I guess this is his way of making it up to them. Giving them 2 candidates that they want.
At the beginning of the campaign, I interviewed Conservative Home's Henry Hill, and I asked him at the end of the show which candidate wants it most, and he said Robert Jenrick.
Yep.
Right.
Look, I hate it when people ask me to make predictions, but let's go around the room ever so quickly. We won't hold you to it. Who are you calling it for?
Start from that. Start from the Tory over there.
Tory Campbell.
On the basis of the Conservative Party's stupendous record in electing leaders over the last 10 to 15 years, I'm going with Kemi.
I'm going to go with Kemi because I think, like you said, we're unreliable witnesses here. And I think that what she said about, we from the outside, we took what she said about maternity leave last week as just a really unacceptable line crossed. But I actually don't think there's that much evidence that the members greeted it in that way.
Well, they're well beyond their reproductive years.
So I think
they have very few shits to give about maternity pay.
She remains as loved as she was, as far as I can see.
There are 2 things battling in me. The first is that Zoe Williams told me last week that Conservatives love to perform non-racism. So they love to select someone that will say and do unpalatable things.
I couldn't possibly be racist. I voted for a black leader.
But still, because this is a private vote in the privacy of their own computer, and because both candidates will be appealing to the hard right of the party, I can't think that they will be just as ready to vote for a black woman as they are for a white man, I'm afraid. And so I think I predict Jenrick.
Interesting. Well, I too am going to say Jenrick, so that we are evenly split and covering our bases, and quite right.
Insiders versus
Can't
outsiders.
be more than 50% wrong. Normally we have a call to action for our listeners. I think it's just have a good laugh. Enjoy the moment. It's the little things in life, guys. So yeah.
And don't forget to stick.
Who am I going to vote for? Seriously, though.
Just spoil your ballot with something really funny. It's electronic.
Stick it on the
You
bathroom
can't,
wall.
it's electronic.
Just in case.
Do I vote for Jenrick on the basis that he's even more likely to lose badly at the next election?
The worst thing that could happen is you back the winner, because then the next 4 years, we are going to be on your bollocks saying it's all your fault.
I'm not going to reveal my vote. It's going to be terribly private. Okay.
All right, well, listeners, if you took Alex's advice a couple of months ago and you too joined
I'm so sorry.
the Conservative Party, don't blame me. Don't punish me because of the sins of my co-host. And if you want to tell us how you're going to be voting, please drop us a line at quietriotpod@gmail.com. Quiet Riot. Now, it is my favourite part of the week, when Alex scours the world for the issues, the products, the people deemed so grossly tofu munching that they must immediately be cancelled by anyone who has ever voted for a right-wing party in their lives. It is, of course, time for Wokie Dokie.
Wokie Dokie.
Alex, I think you may have struck Wokie Dokie. I'm going to say platinum, not even gold this week. So much so that I think we may have to stop doing this segment because I just don't think you're ever going to top this one.
Yeah.
Give us what you got.
Either that or I won't be around after a round of polonium tea and Novichok biscuits.
Uh-oh.
So the West is woke.
Yes, right. The whole
So claims the Kremlin. In a new initiative, now I'm not making any of this up, a new initiative that offers streamlined shared values visas to citizens of 47 countries who oppose, and I quote, the destructive woke ideological agenda of their home country and want to move to Russia. So the Russian embassy's website describes this as the provision of humanitarian support to persons sharing traditional Russian spiritual and moral values.
Wait, sorry. So are these anti-woke asylum seekers?
That's what they are.
Seeking asylum in Russia.
Yeah.
That's right. Correct.
So, right, okay. So,
Correct.
So the very people who
Barrage.
probably hate asylum seekers
Correct.
are now allowed to seek
They are the
asylum.
embodiment of the axiom, if you don't like it here.
And are there safe and legal routes being provided for them?
Okay, so
And how do I fund
Choose
them?
between Rwanda or Moscow.
countries include the US, the UK, most Western countries actually, most of the UEA countries, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Japan and South Korea, but not Hungary.
Okay.
Strangely, I wonder why that is. But also not Ireland.
Excluded again.
Can you imagine if you're an Irish anti-woke
Backhanded.
sitting there going,
Well, no, but they don't. No, but they don't need them, do they? So they're in the Doyle. Well, you saw that amazing story in the front page of the Sunday Times. I mean, incredible. No, Russia doesn't need the Irish.
Yeah, true.
They're already managing them.
Has anybody
Okay.
taken them up on their offer?
I was going to come to that, funnily. One family from the US has already availed themselves. A couple named as Leo Lionel and Chantel Felice. Doesn't sound very traditional to me. She didn't even
Mispronounced Vance.
take his name. Who Moscow claim have moved to the country with their children aged 16, 14 and 11. They must be delighted. So Mr. Lionel was quoted as saying, personally, I want to thank you, President Putin, for allowing Russia to become a good place for families in this world climate. We intend to use this opportunity to benefit our family. I feel like I've been put in an arch of safety.
What?
Until he's
Oh.
conscripted into the army.
Well, and
Funny you
the
should
small
say that.
print.
Now pay attention, listeners. Two tiny details in the small print. First, one can convert this visa permit to permanent citizenship by joining the Russian army and being deployed to Ukraine.
We're going to send you straight back west.
And second, one of the prerequisites is taking out insurance that includes, and I quote from the Russian embassy's release, the cost of posthumous repatriation of remains. So, yeah, good luck with that.
Speechless.
Okay, all right. Look, we don't really.
Everyone is gasping.
We don't really do calls to action for Wokey Dokey segments, but this week we are going to. Listeners, we're going to drop a link in the show notes to the detail of this.
Yeah.
Anytime you see or hear somebody going on about woke leftists, oh, I'm sick of them, or you can't say
Banish
anything,
them
you
with
can't say
Support them.
anything without going to jail these days, you send them that link and you say, off you pop, here you go.
Yeah. If you don't like it here,
And don't forget to put £5 aside for a body bag.
now, the most taboo word starting with a C in English language is not the one you're thinking of, you dirty bastards. It's class, as evidenced by the extraordinarily awkward vox pops that open a stunning new documentary podcast series made by The Conversation called Know Your Place, the first episode of which dropped on Monday. From Keir Starmer's "My father was a toolmaker" to accusations of the politics of envy levelled at Labour for withdrawing a VAT exemption from fee-paying schools, class is ever present yet rarely directly talked about.
What class do you consider yourself to be?
It's a tricky business asking a British person what their class is.
Middle class.
Working class.
Working class?
Working class.
Middle class.
It can make them uncomfortable.
Don't ask me.
So it's super simple. What class do you identify as?
Working class.
And can you tell us a bit more about why you feel that way?
Just my upbringing. Yeah, mainly just my upbringing.
Okay,
Family.
wonderful.
It can even make them a tad defensive.
And would you be willing to answer?
Yeah.
Okay, what class do you identify as?
I don't identify no class whatsoever.
class whatsoever?
I think the whole thing's a fiction.
It does, however, always trigger an interesting response.
I would say in terms of the privilege I have, I would say middle class, but I'd identify as working class from my views and standpoints.
Okay, interesting.
We have with us the host of that documentary series, Laura Hood. What prompted the making of this? What does it hope to achieve?
The incessant refrain of "my father was a toolmaker" was the immediate
Right.
inspiration.
Brilliant.
But it actually stems from an article I worked on a few years ago with John Curtis, who is most famous for doing the exit poll on election night.
He's most famous for doing this podcast.
He's most famous for doing this
Actually,
podcast. Second for doing the exit poll, and third for these findings that showed that 2019 was the official break in the relationship between our class identity and our voting identity. That was the year when your class background no longer acted as a predictor for how you would vote.
Can I ask a quick question before you go on? How are you defining class?
This is a nasty.
Because this is such a British peculiar thing.
So the podcast is funded by the National Centre for Social Research that does an extensive survey on social class identity, and we work from their definition. So it is largely about occupation. But
Income?
In some ways, but mainly about the sort of definition of what your job is and what that job entails. But as we've learned doing this series, there are so many different definitions of class. Different surveys use different metrics. We all have our own internal metrics of what it is to be what class identity
So
is.
just going behind what you just said, would I guess right that a builder who makes more than a middle manager in an office
Or a
might
podcaster.
consider themselves working class, as opposed to a middle manager in an office who makes less than the builder and still considers themselves middle class?
So this is the really knotty question. Yes, probably, but the builder is actually probably more something like the new petty bourgeoisie. He's probably self-employed, and he's probably doing a lot better. He's more likely to own his home than the office worker is now. So we're living in this world where we assign class according to occupation, but the occupations no longer fit any kind of pattern of what we understand to be class structures. Our understanding of occupational class is based on the manufacturing era, when you worked in a factory or you were the boss of the factory, and that just doesn't apply anymore.
And you just did that one job for life.
And you just did that one job for one life, and that job could buy you a house, and you could climb up the social strata. And working in an office was definitely a way to being comfortable, and that is no longer the case at all. And the other thing that is incredibly interesting, which is a very unresolved issue, I think, is what is the status of people who work in the gig economy? They are earning some of the lowest wages in our economy. They are ostensibly self-employed. They are essentially their own masters. They
Entrepreneurs.
earn when they want. Entrepreneurs. They earn when they want to earn. They take the jobs they want to take. They don't take the jobs they don't want to take. But they're earning very little, and in fact, they're really at the behest of an algorithm. The algorithm is your boss. So they're in this sort of middle ground. It's very, very confusing.
But that was something that came up right at the beginning of the first episode. What we're talking about here is which class people actually are. Which pigeonhole do they belong in? But one of the people that you interviewed at the beginning said, I'd say I'm middle class, but I identify as working class from my viewpoints. It's such a 21st century way of taking a gnarly problem and saying we can make it even more complicated now because, yes, you may be middle class, but how do you identify? Do we require a completely different vocabulary for it now, do you think?
I think so, yeah. And I think what we've found is that while the number of people who are objectively working class in our society is dwindling and decreasing, the number of people who self-identify as working class remains the same, and if not increased. So there is this complete disjointed picture of our objective class and our own internal identity.
It's clearly why Kemi Badenoch's doing so well in the Tory...
Well, she worked at McDonald's, so she's working class.
And what does John Curtis say about education? Because I remember during the referendum on Europe and the years that followed, he would always say, Naomi, remember, it's not age, it's education.
Yeah.
And younger people are just more likely to have gone on to tertiary education than older cohorts. So the correlator that you really want to be looking at is educational attainment. And how does that then fit in with what kind of job you do and what kind of class definition you fit into.
I think this is at the heart of the confusion, essentially. What John Curtis wrote is that education is now what predicts your vote. Education is what predicted your Brexit vote in particular.
Yeah.
So younger people are more likely to have benefited from this expansion of higher education, the sort of post-92 expansion of the higher education landscape. More people have the ability to get a degree, but that degree doesn't necessarily buy you a better life. It doesn't necessarily get you a better job or a higher income. So you have all these people with degrees they have all the trappings of a middle-class life, but not the financial benefits of it. And it's just this, everyone is occupying these really weird spaces in between.
And it's absolutely fascinating that millennials are the first generation ever globally to be getting more left-wing with age.
Yes.
Because of that. Because the capitalist system is not working for them because they have no stake in capital whatsoever. The generation coming up behind them, we know, are being persuaded by online extremism far more, and there seems to be a bit of a trend right for the ones coming up behind those millennials. So it is an incredibly fascinating thing when you interweave all of these factors, all of these different cross breaks from the research as to, how... I just think it's making elections increasingly hard to predict. Yeah. I mean, I'm in that game. It's what I do 24/7. It is my day job.
Yeah.
I do a hell of a lot of it at election time, really trying to analyse how different voters in different constituencies are going to break, what messages they need in order to be persuaded. And at the last election, it was infinitely more difficult than 2019, and 2019 was more difficult than the ones before.
I mean, they no longer move as a bloc,
No.
effectively.
I mean, 2019 is the election that John Curtis has pinpointed as being when class finally blew apart as a predictor. But when I was listening to the show, I kept shouting, but Thatcher, surely Thatcher. And then right at the end, of course, Thatcher is your next episode, isn't it?
Yeah.
But without giving too much away, is it fair to say that Thatcher dynamited the foundations of class as a predictor, even though there was lots of dismantling still to be done?
That certainly is what we found. And I think that what John Curtis found was that although 2019 was this break, 2019 was not a class election. We see it as the working class voter flocking to Boris Johnson, but something far more complicated was going on. And this relationship between Labour, the party of the working classes, was fraying and breaking from far earlier than 2019. And Thatcher and the right to buy is a big part of that, but also Tony Blair is really the man that everyone is citing as responsible for this decision to move away from working class voters because it was the electorally sound thing to do has really been the source of this fraying.
And I mean, I think we are sort of multiple identity voters, and I always reject identity politics because of that. You can be many things at once. And I remember a time when religion was a stronger correlator to your voting intention than your social class. That Catholics voted Labour, Anglicans voted Conservative, Jews and Hindus tended to vote Conservative, Muslims Labour. Now, that is absolutely fracturing with the Gaza issue, and we know, and we saw that in some Labour seats. And, of course, people are now much less religious than they were. But then when you really delve into it, and I'm sure John has and would then counter it by saying, yes, Naomi, but particularly Irish Catholics were more likely to be poor. And Anglican Protestants were more likely to have wealth. So it was still really the social class thing.
Still fit in that.
Indeed.
Laura, can I ask something? You mentioned petit bourgeois. And it's interesting, I'd made a note to ask you about that because as a foreigner, that is a term that is familiar to me and incredibly helpful in this conversation because it describes a huge swathe of people that may be one thing but are reaching for the next rung on the ladder, especially for their children, if that makes sense. And that explains, Rishi Sunak, who is growing up in a completely middle-class setup, but they have paid for an education that elevates him to a sort of the next level up. If you asked a number of people, they would go, it's working class, middle class. They don't recognize that bit in between of the aspirational working class.
Yeah, and I think that's where we've made a really big mistake in our politics for a really long time. I think we have this conception that Reform is a party for working class voters, but actually it kind of feels a lot more like it's potentially the party of the, as someone mentions in the podcast, Dan Evans, who's done some really interesting work on the petit bourgeois specifically, or what he calls the new petit bourgeois, that it's potentially Reform is actually a party of people who are financially aspirational, who maybe have sort of working class backgrounds but are self-employed. And what we learned when throwing the term red wall around in 2019 is that actually the red wall voter wasn't exactly who we thought they were, right? It wasn't
a homogenous block.
Yeah. A lot of them were kind of homeowners, people who were living in far more financially secure positions than your average left-wing voter in London. And that's a huge unresolved question in future political alliances.
Yeah.
Both these points actually plug straight back into the core tenets of Thatcherism again, though. It's astonishing to hear her talked about this way. I mean, home ownership was absolutely central, the dream of home ownership to Thatcherism.
Although a lot of things have changed.
Absolutely, but also the idea of pulling yourself up by your bootstraps is quite a brutal approach to aspirations, but it is an aspirational approach.
Yes, and I suspect that people in that group that you described, that Reform voter group that you described, there is a lot of that attitude. I never got a handout. I pulled myself up from my bootstraps. But
I think you did, though. As I think.
Well, exactly.
I think you had
We're talking about perception. We're talking about self-identification more than anything. But I wonder if credit also plays into what you were describing, this idea that people's incomes are getting better, but their perception of themselves as working class is also increasing, because we are in a situation where actually you spend so much of your future income that any change in employment status can be catastrophic. We're all like the vast majority of people are two pay packets away from bankruptcy. So I wonder if that also feeds into a lot of middle class people feeling working class, because actually they're in danger.
That's
they
absolutely
feel
correct.
peril.
And I think that feeds into another theme that has come up again and again and again. It's that a very common experience in Britain today is that you are a middle class person living a middle class life who had working class grandparents and whose parents are occupying this very strange middle ground. And somewhere along the line, your family stopped being working class and started being middle class. But that passage is rarely very clean. And most of those people probably feel that if you were middle class all the way down, you're probably a lot more comfortable right now. If you're middle class from a working class background, as Keir Starmer is really, you are probably living a much more precarious existence. So I think that helps to explain why people feel the need to act up their working class credentials or to at least feel more in touch with their working class background than they might in a more secure environment.
Right, call to action. There could only be one, of course. Find the conversation, subscribe to it. They do a really good newsletter, actually, so definitely subscribe to that. And also look for the podcast. It's called Know Your Place. You can find it in all the usual places. You can download the first episode now, and it will be released at the rate of one a week.
Every Monday for the next 5 weeks.
For the next 5 weeks, and we'll pop links in the show notes.
I do actually have one more, because you mentioned Dan Evans. I will plug his book, A Nation of Shopkeepers, The Unstoppable Rise of the Petit Bourgeoisie. I think that is worth reading. If you're interested in this topic, I've read it. A lot of my team have read it, and I commend it to you, so I'll drop a link to that as well.
Cool. Now, Naomi, it's time for the new listener favourite, which is quite right, because it was actually suggested by listeners.
It was.
And we took them up. They wanted to hear occasional good news. And so it's time for the beautifully, punnily named Grin and Share It.
Good news is welcome to me. Bad news is hell come to me. Good news. I want good news.
What have you got for us today?
Well, I would like to preface this with saying, as we're recording this, Storm Milton is probably about to hit Florida. And of course, that means we need some good news more than ever. But I didn't want it to kind of jar, because by the time this goes out, we could be looking at some absolutely unprecedented disaster coming from the US. So love and thoughts to everyone battling, embracing, though if Mar-a-Lago unoccupied takes a good, vacated
Let's hope
takes
it
a
leaves
good.
everything untouched but completely flattens Mar-a-Lago.
Yes, once everyone in Mar-a-Lago has evacuated to safety, I hasten to add. Anyway, on with the good news story of the week. There has been a huge breakthrough in the treatment for haemophilia. And I think we're all more aware of that horrendous condition because of the scandal around infected blood in the 80s and beyond, where haemophiliacs were very disproportionately impacted by being given factor VIII blood products that were contaminated with disease like HIV and hepatitis, and many lost their lives, many left with incurable conditions. So anything that can help that community, I think, is good news. And a new single-dose gene therapy has led to the number of bleeding episodes for those with haemophilia B to drop by over 70%.
Wow.
And this is coming out of an international phase 3 clinical trial by the University of Pennsylvania School of Medicine. And so what the gene therapy does is it enables the liver to create factor IX, and that allows the blood to clot and prevents patients from these frequent bleeds that can, often, leave them incredibly ill. And one of the study investigators and lead authors, a doctor called Adam Kuka, said what we saw from patients in this study was that within a few days of receiving the gene therapy infusion, it took root and their bodies started to make factor IX for the first time in their lives.
Oh, wow. So it basically stimulates
the production of the thing they need to to be able to clot and not bleed out. Incredible. So we always want to be careful about using the word cure, he says, especially until we have longer follow-up data. But for many of these patients, it's been life-changing. A year on, participants in the study had this average of a 71% reduction in bleed rate compared to the year prior when they were treated with prophylactic infusions of factor IX, which is the standard treatment for the disease. And in fact, more than half of the patients in the study did not have any bleeds at all after receiving the gene therapy. So yay for science. Absolutely wonderful news for families that suffer with haemophilia, and more of these kinds of breakthroughs, please.
Fab. That's 6,000 families in this country alone.
There we go.
That's a huge number.
Good news indeed.
Quiet, Riot. Now, the new government has fired the starting pistol on the reset of the relationship with Europe, I think, at least 20 times. But last week, it kind of became official because Starmer had his first meeting with EU Commission President Ursula von der Leyen. And so I thought we'd talk about what we know. What do we know so far? What do we think is going to happen? We do know that Labour fought the 2024 general election on a platform including economic responsibility and ambition to deliver economic growth. So the economy and people's personal finances will be the defining issue at the next election, because that was the single biggest thing they promised to turn around for everyone. And resetting relationships with the EU at the upcoming review of the Brexit deal, the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, will give the UK government an opportunity to deliver economic growth because it will help to reduce trade barriers. And equally, the policies and the compromises that could emerge as part of those negotiations do risk reviving public debates on key policy areas that the opposition parties, not just Reform, are going to, capitalise on because they are very experienced at doing so. And so I think understanding how policies and compromises emerging from the negotiations with the EU will affect Labour's electoral prospects will be the difference between the relationship reset being electorally advantageous or disadvantageous for both the UK and Labour at the next election. And so I think it's about the management of the negotiations, because without very active management by the government on them, on one side you're going to see the Lib Dems and the Greens especially in their respective 39 and 6 Labour-facing urban seats, using the opportunity to appeal to pro-Europeans.
Say you're not going far enough.
In Scotland, of course, the SNP will do similarly in the 37 seats they came second in to Labour. And remember, we're only 500 days away from Scottish elections.
Oh, yes.
Both in the 89 seats where Labour will be defending against Reform UK and in the 219 seats where the Conservatives came second, Labour is going to be vulnerable to attack messaging on the other side on things like sovereignty, immigration, fisheries policy, etc. And so I think it's perhaps because of these kind of competing risks on the left and right that the government doesn't seem to yet have a clear strategy for what it wants to do. There does seem to be a little bit of a paralysis about how to achieve the reset that they are definitely committed to.
Interesting.
And is why I don't think we've heard much detail. But the one issue that keeps coming up that we mentioned at the top of the show is that in return for less trade friction, Europe would like a youth mobility reciprocal scheme with the UK. And so far, the UK government hasn't committed to it. Alex,
Yeah.
what's the feeling in your waters? Is this going to change anytime soon?
Okay, so a few things to say. The first, I think, is that what might appear as inertia in decision could also be the result of two factions pulling in opposite directions that are roughly of equal power.
But is it within the government?
Within the government.
cabinet?
Yeah, within
Okay.
the cabinet. And as a matter of fact, I think that is as likely, if not more likely, an explanation for this, what you described as paralysis, than anything. And what would make the difference on that if one of the powerful people on either side switched? And the most likely person, I think, is Reeves. It is Reeves that, if she finds that pulling the levers at her disposal does not generate the spurt of growth that she needs for the rest of her programme, I think it is her that is likely to switch over to the let's go after this more actively side, and that will suddenly see a huge burst of activity. That's the first thing. The second thing to say, I think, is that the approach currently being taken by the government is incongruous to what they're doing on the economics. What do I mean by that? They've made a strategic decision to take the pain early on in their 5 years and say, we'll absorb the negative press, we know we'll get into loads of shit, but hopefully by the end of the 5 years, people will be seeing the tangible benefits of our policies and they will come back to us. The same can be said of a closer relationship with the EU. Now is the time, actually, to absorb the pressure. As a matter of fact, with the Conservatives out to lunch for another 3-4 weeks, really now is the opportunity to go for that and say, we're going to plough ahead with this because it's the right thing for the country and you will like it or lump it.
While we've been recording, Pippa Crerar has done a very funny tweet about this distraction of the Tories being out to lunch. She says, one Labour MP texts to ask if the Tory leadership result needs to be declared as a gift.
That is fantastic. My final point was that I chatted to some commission contacts on Friday. As I do every Friday, I have a sort of regular Zoom with my Brussels buddies. And
And they know whatever they say ends up on a podcast.
Well, they kind of do.
Okay.
But nothing that they say is particularly state
Sensitive.
secret. Is
Okay.
that, they just give me the
Vibes.
The vibe. And the vibe in Brussels at the moment is that there is a lot of goodwill, but Labour need to convert that into an actual plan. And Labour at the moment, they don't seem to know what they want from the negotiation going forward. They talk about a reset, they talk about a big rejig of the trade relationship, but if you ask them to name your top 10 things that you would like, they can name maybe 2.
Veterinary agreement.
And I think professional standards is another
Equivalence. Yeah, mutual
sort of
recognition.
said. But it needs to be more than that. It needs to be, if you want the Commission to basically dedicate the staff resources and the oxygen to make this a big all-in negotiation, you have to give them the notion that out the other end will be something significantly different to what they have now. Otherwise, it's not worth their while.
And my point is that they don't have that list.
No.
Because they can't agree. They haven't yet. Or not that they can't agree, but they haven't yet.
Yeah.
You know, I talked about this in the show after the Labour Party conference. There is still a shell shock. They are still getting their feet under the table. They're still trying to figure out multiple things. And this is one of them.
Well, yes, but going to Ursula von der Leyen and having the big summit is a little bit like going to a protest with a sign that says, what do we want? I'm not entirely sure.
When do we
want it now?
And also holding the youth mobility scheme as a bargaining chip against something that you can't quite define.
And I mean, there's a couple of points on that. One is, of course, that this is no surprise. I mean, even the most optimistic of politicians have always said that this is a 10-year project at the minimum to get Britain back to the stage where it could have an adult discussion about genuine re-engagement with Europe. And that takes us into the next decade. It takes us into the next government. So we shouldn't be surprised about it. The other thing is that it's a moving target, of course. And in the world of diplomacy, that's phenomenally difficult. Today, the European Commission has said that it's going to start putting passports on your mobile phones. So having fought for different coloured passports, you'll be able to stick it on your Nokia now.
This is what happens, you see, when you go on holiday. He thinks he's part of the show now.
A gunshot rang out.
Do you know what I mean? We usually don't even give him a fucking microphone. He just has to shout stuff from the corner, and now he's all that.
Shall I put the black bag back on my head, Alex?
Can I ask you something, Laura, from a class point of view? A lot of the criticism of the youth mobility push has been that it's a thing for rich kids from rich families. Is that a fair assessment? Or is it actually one of those things that maybe actually can be the transformational thing from one generation to the next that takes you up
I think it's both. I think it's both. I think Erasmus, what we know is that Erasmus is taken up by wealthier students. And when they tried to come up with a replacement for Erasmus, this Turing scheme, that was actually laudably front and centre of their thinking on the replacement, is that Turing should be much more targeted at underprivileged people, underprivileged students. And the key to that was offering these shorter periods of time. So you're far more likely to take up a placement or an opportunity to study abroad if it's shorter, because it's less daunting when you come from a low-income background to say, I'm going to go away for 2 months, 3 months, and to go for a full year. So it's not impossible that the youth mobility scheme could offer something for people of different classes, but it does need to be quite carefully targeted in that respect. I think that the fact that it's either about working or studying is an improvement on Erasmus as well, because that means that you can go away and, we all know people who have come over from Australia or Canada and taken a job in catering or, in a bar in a hotel, and it's a wonderful experience. And it does seem to be people from all kinds of different backgrounds. So if you can earn money, fantastic. But I think it really is a difficult sell on the other end, right? That does mean that we'll be having lots of people coming in from Europe taking jobs, and that's got to be sold correctly.
You see, to me, the problem with the sales pitch for this kind of thing has always been that too much emphasis has been placed on the people we are sending there and not enough on the people who are coming here, because in my mind, that's the true strength of something like Erasmus+. It creates a layer of people who are effectively friends of the UK because they've experienced the culture, that then go back to their own country and seed that. That is truly soft power.
In the longer term, yes, but in the shorter term, there's this huge problem that UK universities are not happy about the possibility of having to offer places to foreign students at local cost. So the idea that a student would come in from Europe and pay the same fees as a UK student rather than a much higher international.
Just for the benefit of listeners, we cannot and must not conflate Erasmus and a youth mobility scheme. So Erasmus is a scheme with which we would be probably a net contributor to financially. However, I am a huge proponent of Erasmus and I think we should rejoin it. But that isn't really something that is part of the bargaining between the UK and the EU in the TCA review. A youth mobility scheme is. We have them. All our listeners know this. I did an entire show on it last week. We have them with 13 other countries already. our government could set a cap on the numbers. We can negotiate with Europe over the time frame of that. It could be 2 years, 3 years, 5 years. So there is a huge amount of control on it. We had many, many more Brits go to Australia under the scheme last year than we took from Australia. Alex is dead right. The cultural exchange power that comes from people coming to your country, falling in love with it, and then going home and telling people what a wonderful country it is, boost tourist receipts, boost your influence in the world and on the world stage in incomparable ways. And of course, the cultural benefit to us from young Brits going and living, loving and studying abroad is wonderful. So Erasmus Plus, my father was the third president of Erasmus Plus, I think. Yesterday, I was in Greece and I found €2,800 in cash on the floor of a car park. And thank God it had a little receipt in it. And I was able to go to a local Greek person and get them to translate it for me.
This podcast is sponsored
by Big Greek. And it turns out that it was a local school who had collected money from kids for an Erasmus trip to Munich. And the teacher had given it to the travel agent who dropped it. And I say this because it's a reminder that Erasmus is not meant to be a middle-class pursuit, and totally take on board everything Laura says about the perception and whether you feel you can access it or not. But it is actually wonderful at doing stuff for school-aged people as well as university, and giving kids that would never have the opportunity to go abroad to do so through school in a way that maybe their parents just wouldn't be able to fund if it was them taking them away. So 2 things. Don't conflate youth mobility schemes with Erasmus. They are very different. And on youth mobility, I think the call to action that I'd love people to help me out with is the basic one. Please support Best for Britain if you can. We do a huge amount of work on this, bestforbritain.org/join. But I've got another one, and that's that we desperately need older voices to champion it. And the typical response I get from the typical pro-European supporter is, but what about me? But what about older people? Everyone should have freedom of movement. Why should the young people get it and not us?
Did they do it in that voice?
That is how I read every tweet and email and direct message I get about it.
Good luck editing that one, mate.
And it needs countering, and it needs countering fast. We need older people who did get to benefit from freedom of movement when they were young to advocate for young people and plead their case for them. So please be an ally on this. Write to your MP. Shout about it on social media. Talk to your employer about why they should write to the Home Office in favour of a reciprocal youth mobility scheme. Write to Yvette Cooper about it. Explain that it is not a middle-class pursuit, but one that gives opportunities to young people from less well-off backgrounds to use examples, and don't use ones about, like, don't talk about ski seasons. You know, the typical thing is, oh, so-and-so went out and did a ski season because they could and now they can't, and isn't that terrible? Don't use that example. Talk about Club 18 to 30 repping. Talk about working on a farm or in a factory, or, you know, having had your first snog in Magaluf, learning German while teaching kids English after you left school, and write to your local paper about it as well, because we know that MPs, particularly in seats that may have voted majority leave, they scour the local newspapers for the letters pages to see what constituents are talking about. And it does actually matter. After the front page, the letters page is the most read. So please do that. The Guardian actually had a load of letters to the editor that they published today. You might be able to get some inspiration from there. So we'll drop that link in the show notes for you. So yeah, write to MPs, write to your paper, write to the Home Office, tell them that just because you are not going to benefit from an under-30s reciprocal scheme, that doesn't mean you don't support it actively, and you don't need to have children and grandchildren to advocate for young people.
And that's it for today's episode. Thank you so much, first of all, to our guest, Laura Hood.
Thanks for having me.
Remember to find the conversation, subscribe to the newsletter, and find the Know Your Place podcast.
And we mentioned that we are in the process of setting up a Discord channel for our Ko-Fi supporters. Slight technical troubles. Kenny and I are trying to figure those out.
Who knows what the fuse box is?
Anyone who works in IT support who might want to, lend a hand.
That's a great call to action.
Call-
Can some IT
Send
person
techies.
that can make our Ko-Fi talk to our Discord, please contact us.
Because at the moment, it is almost certainly picnic. Problem in chair, not in computer. But yeah, keep your eyes peeled and your ears open for more news on that soon.
And please, if you can, do support us on Ko-Fi. That's ko-fi.com/Quiet Riot Pod. As you know, our policy is to make all of our content available for free to everyone and depend on good people who can afford it to go and support us. So please do that and rate us on your favorite podcast app, give us a review, talk about us on social media, generally spread the good word.
And they do, they really do.
No, I know.
It's
I
wonderful.
think they've got a bit complacent recently.
Up your game.
They've got
End of year appraisal incoming.
They think, I've plugged them enough. You never have. You never have.
Do it, or there'll be more Kenny on next week.
Now there's a threat.
Thank you, everybody, for listening. And if you're tuning in from America, stay safe as you brace for Hurricane Milton. We'll be thinking of you all. And we'll be back again on Sunday. Bye for now. Quiet Riot is an audio production by Cooler Heads with Naomi Smith, Alex Andreu and Kenny Campbell. Music by Mariana Sanguita, artwork by Simona Canelu. Quiet Riot is a co-production with Soundstone Global. Quiet Riot. Thank you.
Finding stains down my top. Have I actually... Am I actually that age now where everything I
Wear
eat,
your lunch.
everything I eat, I basically soil myself.
Welcome to our little podcast.
Our highly professional...
Oh boy.